How this nerdy teen became FBI's most wanted trafficker.
Hiking across the Canadian forest, the group of high school boys were on the verge of a mental breakdown. They had just spotted a DEA van stalking them in the woods, because inside these kids' backpacks was over 400 pounds of weed. You see, these weren't your average high schoolers.
400 pounds of weed in 5 backpacks? Dude, that's heavy as shit.
These kids had a smuggling empire that had brought in 17,000 pounds of weed, and their parents would kill them if they ever found out. Undetected, the boys'
parents would kill them? 500 pounds of weed? You're gonna get thrown in federal prison. That is like an obscene amount of marijuana.
Dropped to the floor to find a way around it. But Nate Norman, the leader of the group, shushed the others and flicked his night vision goggles to get a closer look and began smirking at what he saw. These DEA agents they were so afraid of that could end everything that night were asleep in their van this entire time. And as the boys snuck by and made it home safely that night, Nate Norman, the leader of the group, had just made the easiest money he'd ever made in his life, $500,000.
In high school, for bringing a backpack of weed over, bro made $500,000 in cash. How do you money launder that? You're in high school. You can't money launder $500,000.
2001, 2 rival groups of high school nerds became the biggest drug smugglers in the United States. Invading the DEA, FBI, and Border Patrol for years, they had smuggled in 17,000 pounds of weed, making $32 million. But through jealousy, betrayals, and shady deals, their empires would fall apart before any of them could legally drink. This is the true story of the nerdy teens who became drug kingpins. Now, Nate Norman wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. As a broke 19-year-old high school dropout working at Pizza Hut living in his mom's basement in Idaho, the closest he'd ever gotten to organized crime was watching Scarface on cable. Because with no degree and a dead-end job...
Yeah, how do you get into that? How do you get into... How do you say one day you're just sitting there and you're like, I want to smuggle weed for money. That's not doing anything, right? Like there's a moment where I feel like the opportunity has to arrive or arise before you actually say, I'm going to do this, right? Because you're not just sitting there like, I'm going to start selling drugs. You can't just decide that, right? Like if you're sitting in your house and you're like, I'm going to sell meth. I'm going to sell meth. What do you do? That's not like a career option. You're probably like given the option and then you decide to do it rather than deciding you want to do it before you're given the option.
The American dream felt so far away for Nate Norman. Changed one day when Nate and his buddy Topher were smoking a J, flipping through Times magazine, and stumbled across a story that would change their lives forever. Canada had the best weed in the world, BC buds, and smuggling BC buds across the border? Oh, it's a $7 billion business. Wait a sec, Nate thought. Idaho's right next to the Canadian border. Now, while people knew Nate delivered pizzas around town, he also delivered sacks. Although Nate's prices were high and his bud quality sucked. But knowing that the best buds in the entire world were just a few hours away, Nate could sell the hell out of it if he could just get his hands on it. So that's when he turned to Topher and said, we should become international drug smugglers. Now, while this idea of
this is literally just We're the Millers, the movie in real life, but with high schoolers. What a way better, they should make a movie about this. What a way better movie idea. It's just 4 high schoolers that are like, hey, let's go fucking smuggle drugs. And then it's them just going to Canada trying to obtain hundreds of pounds of weed to fucking move it back into Idaho, the fucking potato fucking state.
Criminal enterprise sounds great to a 19-year-old. A pound of weed costs money, and they were both broke. Pizza Hut didn't pay great, and Topher worked part-time at Castle Park. But Topher, believing in his best friend Nate, sold an old boat he had dragged out of the lake for $1,400, and assuming that was enough to buy a pound of weed, the two head on to Canada with what was their life savings. But after coasting through the checkpoint, they quickly realized Canada was not what they thought it was.
And where do you go? Where do you go? It's 2000. I want a pound of weed. I'm going to a different country. I pull up to Canada. Am I going person to person saying, hey, do you got a pound of weed? Where's the weed? I drove all this way. Anybody selling marijuana here? No? Oh, that sucks.
See, High Times made it seem like people sold pounds of weed on the side of the road, but it really just looked like the US, except kilometers. What the So empty-handed after hours of searching for a vendor, the two head into a Canadian bar to at least make the trip worthwhile. Maybe Nate's plan was too ambitious, he thought. It almost seemed too easy. But old man Frankie, a regular at the bar, gestured at the two Americans sticking out like sore thumbs. As Nate and Topher walked over to him, they said, "Could you help us procure a pound of flowers?" 1 pound? Frankie said he had dozens, of Canada's finest, but it was all back at his apartment. And while Nate and Topher tried to contain their excitement, thinking this was their big connect for BC Buds, well, old man Frankie had just found his next victim. But inside his crappy apartment, the two realized Frankie actually seemed a bit sketch. But I mean, where else were they gonna go? They were desperate. "How much cash you got?" Frankie said. "For $1,400.
Why would you say, bitch, I'd be like, I have $200. I would lie. I would say, how much does a pound of weed cost? You're gonna tell him he's a $1,400. Oh, that's exactly how much a pound costs. Thank you.
Is that enough for a pound?" "That's perfect. That's exactly what a pound costs," Frankie said. But as Nate opened up the bag to get a whiff of those BC Buds he had traveled all this way for, Frankie tells him that wouldn't be wise. I mean, they didn't want to get caught from the smell. So without even waiting,
Oh my God, does he sell them oregano?
Smelling or barely even looking at it, the two hand over what was their life savings to a
Does he get ripped?
sketchy grandpa they just met at a seedy Canadian bar. And with the pound of BC Buds in hand, they began the hardest part now, trying to get home. Now, according to High Times, the Canadian border is 5 times longer than the Mexican one. But there's no fence. I mean, you walk in the woods, next thing you know, you crossed international lines. And while thousands of smugglers hid weed in horse trailers, snowmobiles, sailboats, hollowed out logs, hell, even underground tunnels, hiking weed across the border was just the easiest, but also the riskiest. So the plan? Nate was gonna drive back home by himself.
Wait, you could just walk across the Canadian border? There's not like a fence? Or like border patrol? I could just like walk into Canada and just be in Canada?
Himself. Hours later, with dirt on his face, Topher saw his first sign of American civilization. Outback Steakhouse, where there's no rules. It's just right. With Nate parked outside, Topher hopped in for a celebratory smoke of their freshly smuggled BC Buds.
No.
It seemed like the plan had worked. It had all gone well. But after the first hit, something was off. This wasn't the creme de la creme BC Buds. No, Frankie had sold them Mexican brickweed at BC Bud prices. Or in other words, this should have been $400 a pound, not $1,400. Frankie had sold them buds that were grown in Mexico, smuggled into the US, smuggled into Canada, and then smuggled back down to the United States. And that's when they learned you can't
So it was shit weed. And it was probably old.
anyone in the game, including the ancients, the elderly, and the weak. But luckily enough, the weed drought in Idaho was so bad they could actually still make money on this. Nate hit up his old friend Scuzz to have him sell it on the streets, and Scuzz was a connected dude even at 18 years old. Selling it to every hood rat in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Days later, Scuzz came back with $2,800, double what they had bought it for. And with his business model proven to work, Nate turned to Topher and said, High Times was right. Why doesn't everyone do this? Because according to their calculations, Nate and Topher were shocked to find out they could make $3 million in just 14 months by doubling their money with every smuggling run. And to them, that seemed like enough.
I wouldn't want to be responsible for selling, though, because, like, yeah, they can fucking smuggle the weed, but if they also have to smuggle the weed and sell the weed, then they're taking on 2 fucking potential you're gonna get arrested. Whereas if they just smuggle the weed, then that's all they gotta do.
Because with $3 million in hand, the two could buy homes, start a business, and leave the game while they were ahead. Because when drug dealers get caught, it's always because they get too greedy and give themselves away, but that wasn't gonna be them. They promised to themselves no guns, no girls, nothing flashy.
You think this is actually them?
But little did they know that once you're in the game, there's no easy exits. Because while the rewards are great, the risks are even greater. With 1 pound became 2, became 4, became 8, and Nate was growing more comfortable driving thousands of dollars through the Canadian checkpoint, flashing a little disarming wave and a little lip smile. But today, as he coasted through the Canadian checkpoint driving the crest in Canada, Nate really thought about it. This was the ticket out for him. He didn't need college. Hell, with a few more smuggle runs, he could buy his mom a car, and if he found a good grower, Nate could make the big bucks. But then, in his rearview mirror, he spotted those Canadian red and blue lights. Sirens grew louder. Nate Norman was getting pulled over by the cops. With American license plates, he knew...
Dude, imagine getting pulled over in another country with, like, 400 pounds of weed in your car. I think I'd have a heart attack. You're already going to be so off-puttingly nervous that it's just, they're gonna search your car. Like, they're not gonna, there's no doubt.
Stuck out like a sore thumb. As the Mountie parked his car and stepped out, every step he took, Nate could only think about how he was. But as he rolled down his window, the Mountie said, So, hey, you guys smuggling? Well, because you're not going to get any flour going to Creston. It's a bunch of loggers. You need to go to Nelson. Don't speed. This is a little warning. Yeah. Getting let off the hook and even a tip on where to find the holy grail of BC buds, Nate was totally wrong. Canada was way different.
The cop told him where to get weed? Like to buy or to smuggle back to the U.S.?
Than the United States. Now, bigger than tourism, logging, hell, even maple syrup. In 2001, BC Buds was a $7 billion a year business in Canada, and Nelson was the capital of it. But why? Well, Canada had some of the most relaxed bud laws in the world at the time.
I generally feel there's a slightly more humanitarian government around here. It's not into putting people away for the rest of their life for their choice of herbs.
And hydroponic stores that sold tomato growing equipment sprawled all around the city, and the result was the golden age of BC buds that were sought all around the world. And for Nate, this is what High Times was talking about. So walking into several Canadian hydroponic stores, Nate finally found the real BC bud growers that could get him the product to bring down serious weight to the United States. And for Nate, the money would begin pouring in, while millions of Americans...
There's not like a limit in Canada on how much weed you can legally buy and how much you can buy in cash, because I feel like that's a bit sketchy. Like, I couldn't walk into my local dispensary in New Jersey and buy fucking 10 pounds of weed. They would be like, dude, what?
On a typical run, Nate and Topher waited until dark and drove within a mile of the border on a remote access road, where Topher, dressed in all camo, would leap out and disappear into the trees. But instead of Nate driving the money over the border, Topher was carrying a hockey bag stuffed with cash for over 7 miles, would exchange with the growers directly in Canada, head back down to America. While back in the States, he would hand the bag off to Nate, who would hand it off to Scuzz, who would hand it off to hundreds of dealers. And for all of this, Topher made $1,000 with each run, while Nate...
That blows!
By this point, had pocketed over 150 grand, more money than he had ever seen.
Wow, fake friend though. No lie, fucking fake ass friend. Holy shit, they did this together first run, and now bro's making 1/150th of what he's making. Like, yeah, he's doing all the grunt work, but I'd be like, yo, he's smuggling the weed. He should at least be making 50, maybe 50, 100.
For 150 grand, more money than he'd ever seen in his lifetime. You see, BC buds were in demand, and Nate's operation needed to expand. With serious money coming in, the boys got serious about their methods. Topher hired friends from high school to help him run, since these hauls were too heavy for just one dude. By now,
hiring your high school friends is a wild fucking idea that is going to dramatically backfire. Say, at the age of, like, he's probably like 21 now, he's like, oh yeah, let me ring up my boy from sophomore track. Hey, do you wanna smuggle weed for me? Yeah, man.
It was 6 Toyota 4Runners filled with runners that would head towards the border drop point, where they would all change in the camo, slip out into the trees carrying hockey bags full of cash, up to 400 grand. Now, while months earlier they all said they wouldn't be flashy with their money, slowly they all began to get the things they had always wanted. 4-wheelers, jet skis, plasma screen TVs, mini disc players, whatever they got, it was the most expensive version of it. Scuzz moved out of his mom's basement and told her he was renting a little crappy apartment, but in reality, he bought a lakeside home. Nate began throwing elaborate lingerie parties, inviting half of the town nearly every other week.
Aren't they gonna ask where you're getting that fucking money from and why you only have cash? If I'm a fucking real estate agent, and this kid comes up to me, and he's 19, and he buys a fucking $500,000 home with cash, I'm going to be like, you sell fucking drugs. That is the only thought that's going into my mind. Is either A, you're a fucking famous rapper or some shit, or B, you sell drugs.
And while as the boss, Nate should have been keeping tabs on who was too loud, well, Nate was actually the worst offender. Nate bought himself an 8-bedroom mansion, several stash houses, an Escalade with 24-inch rims, diamond chains, Dom Perignon, Gatson straps, and 8 balls of nose candy, and like most drug dealers, became convinced he would become a rapper, so he bought studio time with this drug money. But not all was wild. Nate had found a lovely girlfriend that he had met at a church event. Just kidding, she was a stripper, and her name was Buffy. And Nate showered her with all of the jewelry, Gucci bags.
Her name was Buffy? That's not a real name.
Cabo. And as foolish as it was to draw all of this attention to himself, Nate had just never been cool in his life. He just couldn't resist it. While his high school friends used to call him the Keebler elf growing up, those same friends were now working for Nate. But when Nate's mom asked him where he was getting all of this cash from, well, he told her it was his snowplow business. And then bought her a lakeside home, and she never asked again. You see, Nate had been a paper boy, a telemarketer, cashier, pizza man, but he learned that the only get-rich-quick scheme that actually works in this world is selling drugs, and Nate was
the only get-rich-quick scheme. You gotta sell drugs. You just gotta sell meth. You gotta sell crack. You can sell weed, not in today's world. Now you probably gotta sell like fucking ketamine. Maybe just start selling like Oxycontin or something.
A year later, the crew had swelled to 32 people, and they're moving thousands of pounds all over the country. Nate's janky operation? Nah, it transformed into a well-oiled machine. But even then, they still had problems. One night, the runners walked into DEA agents sleeping in their truck in the forest. On a 14-below winter night, they'd lost sight of the trail and nearly froze to death in the dark. Now, the drive home was arguably the riskiest part of the entire run. So Nate began rigging all of the forerunners with explosives, so if they ever got pulled over by the American cops, they could just set the weed on fire. You see, the stakes were high because getting caught now meant—
What? You're in the car! What do you mean you're just gonna set the weed on fire?
If they ever were arrested, just give him a call from the jail, he would pay for their bail and their attorneys, and it would all be good. But Topher grew nervous with this flashy lifestyle and growing operation. He begged Nate to get out of the game, but Nate joked he would never stop until the cops got him, because in his mind, he could just pay for the best attorneys to get him out. So why not go hard? Because that $3 million goal? Nah, that's what Nate now made in a month. So to shut Topher up, he raised—
Bro, I just quit. I just stopped.
His pay to $8,000 a run, locking his best friend, the guy that had helped him start this entire thing, in golden handcuffs. But Topher's fears almost came true when a fight broke out over a girl at a 150-person party the crew was hosting. One of Nate's dealers shot a gun in the air to break up the fight, but nobody even heard it. So Nate, plastered as hell, shot off a .45 Magnum into the house. The crowd began screaming, everyone scattered, the neighbors called the cops, cars sped off and crashed into the fences, and Scuzz got pulled over on his way home with 20 grand in his pocket, nearly peeing in his pants. The cops, they let him go. And then the next night, they threw another party at the same house, equally as crazy. See, they felt invincible. They were rich. They were cool. And by now, the cops either didn't know about their operation or just didn't even care. In Nate's eyes, nobody had gotten hurt. Nobody had gotten caught. Maybe this could just go on forever. At 3 a.m., Nate gets a frantic call. Scuzz was robbed by 3 masked men. They broke inside of his home, held him at gunpoint, and wanted to know where was the cash and the buds, or else one of the burglars, Giovanni, was gonna chop his finger off. Now, for Scuzz, handing them 40 grand in cash and a couple pounds in buds wasn't the end of the world, but Nate had seriously ruffled someone's feathers because they knew not just what they were up to, but also where they lived. Now, Nate Norman wasn't the only teenager—
Ain't that a sign to get out the game? I'd quit. I'd say, sorry, here's the rest of my bud. I'm done. Right? Like, what the fuck? I feel like that's where you're like, all right, that's where I call it quits, right? Somebody's threatening my life. Somebody's threatening my friend's life right now, right? They're going to your fucking house.
Adopted by insurance executives in Idaho, and Wang had grown up with the perfect life. He played the violin, honorable student, but at 17 years old, the kid broke bad. See, Wang began running his own wildly successful bud smuggling operation, transforming from the Kumon kid into a wankster driving an Eldorado lowrider, popping oxys and snorting yay all day long. In many ways, Wang was a lot like Nate, a nerdy teen who just grew into a drug kingpin, but he was also Nate's polar opposite. You see, Wang wasn't satisfied in pulling in millions with his friends. Hell no. He wanted the whole market. Now, Nate knew of Wang and other dealers in town, but figured there was so much money in the game that everyone could eat good. But no, Wang's thriving business had been falling apart since Nate's arrival, and Wang was growing desperate to gain back his market share. Sniffling his nose after racking a couple lines, Wang called up his old roommate Giovanni for a little job proposal. A hit job, to take out Nate Norman.
Oh my
Promising
God.
to pay $100,000 for the job with a $5,000 down payment up front that he would get him later. Giovanni, a dude who had never committed a crime in his life, said why not? So Giovanni called his friends and headed to the Cayman.
Dude, $100K to fucking kill somebody is like, why? He's just like, all right, yeah. You don't even know the guy. You're just like, well, I'll give you $100 grand if you fucking shoot this guy in the face. Oh, okay.
Mart to buy supplies for the hit job. A tarp, gloves, windbreakers. Wang gave him a couple handguns and for good measure, a knife as well. Since Giovanni thought, well, you can't have fingerprints if you don't have fingers. Now, Wang figured it'd be a really simple job. To exonerate himself on the night of the hit, he threw himself an alibi party to be seen by as many people as not murdering Nate. But instead of Giovanni doing the hit that night, they broke into Scuzz's apartment, stealing the pounds of bud and $40K in cash. Because
so they fucked
Giovanni
up.
still hadn't received that $5,000 down payment yet. So we thought, why not make some extra money robbing Nate's crew first and then murdering Nate? Makes sense. Now, when Nate heard about Scuz's robbery, he figured it was the cartel or maybe some other gangbangers in town, but he didn't even realize he was in a turf war with the only other nerdy kingpin in town, Wang. And for the first time, Nate was truly spooked. He moved out of his house. He rented another one across town. He started sleeping with the loaded handgun under his pillow. And Nate—
I'd move fucking countries. You just moved, you moved 5 minutes away from where you lived previously? What the fuck?
Nate would try to lay low the rest of that summer, moving in with Buffy. But after breaking both of his arms flipping over his dirt bike, Nate developed—
You might be closer to him.
serious addiction to painkillers. And even worse, Buffy couldn't even take care of him because she had gotten a boob job. Nate was living in fear, addicted to painkillers, and worst of all, his girlfriend had really big boobs. On November 13, 2002, a lumberjack discovers a murdered boy in the forest. Now, police identify the boy as Brendan Butler. Brendan's parents were in shock. They told the cops he had played the violin. He was an honor roll student, a traditional good boy. I mean, who the hell would end his life? But digging further, the cops discover Brendan Butler lived a double life. Under the nickname of Wang, he was a big-time dealer distributing buds all over the United States, and that his #1 business rival was Nate Norman.
Dude, there's no way. I just feel like that's a bad parent. I refuse to believe that anyone living in the same home as their parents can hide the fact that they are a multi-million-dollar drug dealer and basically a fucking kingpin. Like, they're just... Like, you can't hide that.
He had transformed from a pizza delivery driver living in his mom's basement
How are they protecting
to a kingpin
that?
with a smuggling empire that even the cartel was jealous of. It just didn't seem out of the question that Nate could be involved, but Nate was having bigger problems to fry. Now, that month, some of Nate's dealers got picked up by the cops who found cash, drugs, and guns on him. Now, from jail, the dealers took their customary one phone call, and that's when the cops heard them saying, "Tell Nate, I'm in jail." The DEA, the FBI, and Homeland Security now knew that Nate Norman was the guy behind this entire operation. But what happened to Wang, or Brendan Butler? Now, you see, Wang had no idea his own hitmen were pissed off at him. He was so coked out and on drugs, he literally forgot he owed them money. So withholding that $5,000 for months, Wang took Giovanni and his crew to the forest where he wanted Nate's body to be buried when the murder was done. Now there, Giovanni asked him again for the down payment. Wang said, "Don't worry about it, bro." Giovanni got pissed. Wang told him to chill out. Giovanni grabbed Wang by the neck, squeezing harder and harder. Wang, hardly able to talk, begged for his life. But Giovanni did not know how to stop what he had started. Choking Wang to death, Gio slashed his throat to hide the fingerprints, took the cash on him, and left Wang's body on the exact spot that Nate's body was supposed to be buried. But now with the body being found and the murder and the fingers and the money, Nate knew it was probably time to step out of the game. Now, with the heat on Nate's crew thinking that he could be responsible for Wang's murder, all of the runners would meet at a stash house at dawn to pack up all of their things and skip out of town. But instead, when they got there, they kicked around, smoking weed, reminiscing on the good times. And then right then and there, across 4 states, serving 6 warrants, the FBI arrested runners, managers, dealers,
16 warrants? They arrested everybody simultaneously.
Except for Nate Norman. You see, while the cops had been tracking Nate Norman ever since Wang's murder, somehow he had outwitted the FBI, the DEA, Homeland Security for months, the same way he had avoided Giovanni. But without Nate there to pay off his crew's bail and all of their attorney fees, one by one, they all began to rat out Nate Norman and reveal the entire operation. But once Nate heard the feds had turned the crew on one another and told them all they were all going to go to jail for a very long time unless they got everyone, Nate Norman walked into the police station and the cops could not believe their eyes. They were expecting a hardened criminal mastermind, but they got a kid that used to deliver pizzas. Now, while the feds estimated 2,500 pounds were smuggled in reality, they had moved over 17,000 pounds of weed over the border.
17,000 fucking pounds of weed. 32 mil. And that was in the early 2000s. Today, that's probably even fucking more.
$32 million. Barely out of their teens, these kids had embarrassed the United States government, and somebody was going to take the fall. Giovanni was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Brendan Butler. Scuzz and Topher were given 2 years in the slammer, and Nate Norman would get 12 years. And a sick twist of fate—
So he's out! Nate Norman. I need to see him. Oh, this is him when he got arrested. This guy looks 35. You're telling me this dude is 22? That guy does not look 22 years old. This video is so good, it is. Dude, Vintage just makes fire fucking videos, though.